It's time to break down every little detail about North America's longest sports car endurance race. The event at Daytona is considered to be one of the races that the majority of drivers, teams, and manufacturers want to win. But what are the details of this iconic race? Well, with the event in 2025 coming up fast, it's a good time to break down the information, as this is the Rolex 24 at Daytona fully explained. Le Mans, Nürburgring, Sebring, Spa. There are many lawn endurance races out there that test driver, team, and machine, and one of those events is the race at Daytona. This venue is called the 24 Hours of Daytona, but for sponsorship reasons, it's referred to as the Rolex 24 at Daytona. And this classic endurance race has been held every year since the inaugural event except once, at the track which is named the Daytona International Speedway. Opened on February 22nd of 1959, the circuit is located in Daytona Beach, Florida in the United States of America. And interestingly, the 24-hour endurance race held here is not the most famous event at this track, as what's arguably more famous is NASCAR's crown jewel of the championship, the Daytona 500, which has been going ever since 1959. Although the Rolex 24 at Daytona is also a very challenging and thrilling race, and in fact, it's become a part of what some people call the Triple Crown of endurance car racing, which not only includes Daytona, but also the 24 Hours of Le Mans in France, and another iconic Floridian race, the 12 Hours of Sebring. Just like Le Mans and other 24-hour motorsport events, the cars compete for 24 hours straight, and don't stop until the checkered flag, and this therefore tests the reliability, competitiveness, and sheer determination for all parties involved. Now, like I mentioned before, the Rolex 24 at Daytona is North America's longest sports car endurance race, and it usually kicks off the year for prototype endurance racing. Currently, the Rolex 24 at Daytona is housed within the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, and usually sees the IMSA prototypes and GT cars competing for victory in the event. Since there are multiple cars out on track, traffic becomes a major factor at Daytona, and in some sections of the track, it's arguably harder to overtake than Le Mans. And speaking of the track, there's a major factor that I want to mention. Since this is a beginner's guide, for anyone that's unaware, the cars racing in this prestigious endurance race will not be competing on the full layout of the Speedway's oval, like the NASCAR cars do, but in fact, the cars will be racing on the road course layout of Daytona, which does feature some portions of the oval layout as well. The road course layout of the Daytona International Speedway features a total of 12 turns, which makes up the 3.5 mile or 5.7 kilometer circuit. And the cars will be racing on the oval from turn 6 onwards, all the way up until the next lap at turn 1. Although, in between those sections, the cars do get off and back on the oval at the infamous bus stop chicane, which was renamed to the Le Mans chicane in 2023, to celebrate the new era of prototype racing with the LMH and LMDH regulations being established. And because Daytona has a chicane named Le Mans, the Circuit de la Sarthe in France also named their first chicane Daytona. When it comes to the drivers, there are more than 200 racers that compete in this event, and they must perform interchangeable stints depending on strategy. And the lineups must consist of at least 3 racers, but more than 3 drivers are allowed to compete. For example, the car that won in 2024, which was the number 7 Porsche Penske 963, had a lineup that consisted of 4 drivers, including Felipe Nasr, Dane Cameron, Matt Campbell, and finally Joseph Newgarden. Since this is a multi-class event, this means there are multiple races going on at once. Each of the 4 current classes have their own individual victories for cars competing in those categories to secure. But the main prize is of course the overall win, and usually it's claimed by the high-performance prototypes like the LMH and LMDH entries, although in the past, other cars like GTs have won overall as well. Unlike events like the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Monaco Grand Prix, or the Indy 500, The achievement for winning Daytona is not a big trophy, but a special Rolex watch, which will be handed out to the winners of each class. In the beginning of this event, sports car endurance races were held at Daytona, with the longest distance covered being around 18 hours in the mid-60s. But in 1966, the first ever 24-hour distance race was established and completed, and the first event was won by Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby, driving a Ford GT40 run by Shelby American Incorporated. And in fact, the event would play a pivotal role in the epic story of Ford versus Ferrari. From 1966 onward, the 24 Hours of Daytona was born, and soon became a classic sports car endurance race that many people wanted to win. The venue continued to provide great action, and at the end of the 1960s, the brands of Ford, Ferrari, Porsche, and Lola had all won apiece, and no manufacturer yet had taken success twice. But that was all about to change, as at the turn of the decade, Porsche reigned supreme once again at Daytona, clinching victory 2 times with the iconic 917K in 1970 and 1971 with the JW Engineering Squad. Porsche becoming the first brand to win twice at the 24-hour event, and in consecutive fashion, foreshadowed what was to come for the German manufacturer, as to this day, they are the most successful car brand at the 24 Hours of Daytona, with 19 overall victories achieved so far. Moving on, and the 24-hour race at Daytona became linked with IMSA in 1975, with Hurley Haywood and Peter Gregg taking the Brumos Porsche team to overall victory. And speaking of Hurley Haywood, he eventually became the most successful driver of the 24 Hours of Daytona, after winning 5 times overall, and he shares that record with another famous American driver, Scott Pruitt, who won his most recent event of Daytona overall in 2013. During the legendary Group C era of endurance racing, the 24 Hours of Daytona got increasingly more popular, when brands like Porsche, Nissan, Jaguar, and the Toyota-powered Eagles from All American Racers all won at Daytona during this era. However, after IMSA went through the difficult stage when the racing became separate, the 24 Hours of Daytona became part of the Grand Am Rolex Sports Car Championship, and the competition became a little different from what we had seen beforehand. Although there was still some great action during this time, especially in the GT classes, and in fact, some of the GT cars actually were able to take overall victory. For example, in 2000, Dodge beat the Corvettes and outlasted the prototypes with the Viper GTS-R entries. And in 2001, the Corvette C5R won overall. And those weren't the only 2 modern GT cars that took overall victory, as 2 years after Corvette's win in 2001, the Racer Group's Porsche 911 took the win overall. In 2003, Daytona prototypes were introduced, and while they were nothing like the previous Group C or LMP1 cars racing in the American Le Mans series at the time, they still provided some competition out on track. Riley's Mark 11 Daytona prototypes and their Evo variants dominated the Rolex 24 from 2005 to 2015, and so far, the Riley DPs have been the most successful cars in history in terms of wins at Daytona, with 10 overall victories achieved. In 2014, when IMSA was reformed, the 24 Hours of Daytona, now under the name of the Rolex 24, returned to run as the first round in IMSA's main championship, and ever since, it has remained the opening event of the season. Eventually, IMSA's return re-established high-performance prototypes to fight for overall victory, and in 2017, IMSA introduced the DPI cars, and with those regulations present, Daytona would see more manufacturers fight for overall victory, like Cadillac, Mazda, Acura, and the Nissan-powered and sponsored Ligier cars. Alongside the DPIs, Daytona also saw LMP2 and LMP3 cars race at the 24-hour event, and while LMP2 cars have continued to race to this day, the LMP3 cars ran their last Rolex 24 at Daytona in 2023. Almost simultaneously to the introduction of DPI, the Rolex 24 also had a healthy GT class as well, with GTE cars providing amazing action, and after being introduced in IMSA GTD in 2015, GT3 cars were starting to become more popular in IMSA, and thus the Rolex 24 at Daytona too. And eventually, they replaced the GTE cars in the professional category. In 2023, the 61st edition of the Rolex 24 finally saw the introduction of the LMDH cars, which would join the grid and replace the DPI entries, which significantly improved the grid size at Daytona in the top category, which would now be renamed to the Classic GTP class. And even though Le Mans hypercars could race at Daytona, no one at the time brought over their car to IMSA. In 2023, Acura, Porsche, Cadillac, and BMW brought their cars to fight for overall victory, with Acura and Meyershank Racing eventually winning the first event. In the next year in 2024, the fight for overall victory at Daytona in GTP was very intense, more so than 2023, and some people even described round 1 of the WeatherTech Championship as the best race of the season, with Porsche and Cadillac competing in an intense race lawn battle for the overall lead, which eventually resulted in Porsche winning out. Overall, the Rolex 24 at Daytona has provided and will continue to provide some of the best sports car endurance racing action across the globe, as many amazing drivers, teams, and manufacturers have committed themselves to win this great American endurance race. So what are your thoughts on IMSA's flagship endurance race, the Rolex 24 at Daytona? Is it ranked as one of the best sports car endurance racing events on your list? Well, I'd be interested to know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like endurance racing, definitely subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I'm releasing videos on a weekly basis regarding the WEC, IMSA, Intercontinental GT, and much more. To watch more content now, check out these suggested videos I've put on screen. For now though, that's all from me. Thanks for watching.